The sky hasn't been anything close to natural in years. Not blue, not gray, nothing that resembles the world we once knew. Now it hangs above us like a wound that never heals, a swollen, bruised membrane pulsing with the heat trapped beneath it. It's always red, like the atmosphere itself is bleeding out. Some nights, when the temperature dips low enough to see your breath, rare as that is, you can spot the streaks of orange and black twisting together, like wildfire smoke trapped in the clouds. But that's not smoke anymore. That's the air. I remember when the world had seasons, winter, spring, names that don't mean anything now. Today, the only season we know is survival. Every hour is a negotiation between us and a planet that's given up on us. And honestly, I don't blame it. What used to be cities are just the skeletons of ambition. Towers that once glowed with office lights and life are now charred spires of broken concrete, leaning into each other as if exhausted. When the collapse hit, wildfires spread faster than warnings could be broadcast. Heat waves snapped infrastructure like twigs, and then came the droughts, longer than any of us ever thought possible. Rivers disappeared, lakes became dust basins, and entire coastlines swallowed themselves as the oceans surged and retreated in violent spasms. I used to live near a river. Now, what's left of it is a long, jagged scar across the earth, cracked mud curling upward like dead skin. You can walk across it in under a minute without getting your shoes dirty. People used to gather there, desperate for any sign of moisture, digging deep into the riverbed with tools or bare hands. But that was years ago. Even the memory of water has started to fade. What remains of civilization is scattered. The government fell apart in waves, first the local municipalities, then the state structures, and finally the national systems that once felt unbreakable. They weren't. They cracked just like everything else. Some regions tried to maintain order, but order needs resources, and there were none left to command. Eventually, the last messages we got from what was left of the federal emergency channels were simple, frantic, and short-lived. Now, communication is a dead language, except for people like me, scraping together old broadcast equipment, scavenged wires, and whatever electricity we can generate by hand. The radio is the only lifeline left, not for news, not for leadership, but for voices, for proof that someone else is still alive out there. You can't walk anywhere without feeling like you're being watched, not by people, but by the ruins themselves. Every building groans with age and heat, metal warping in the relentless temperatures. Asphalt melts on the hottest days, sticking to your boots like black tar. Cars sit abandoned, half buried in sand drifts that blow in from places that were never deserts before. Drought reshaped everything. Forests turned to tinder, long before they burned. Grasslands became vast plains of dust. Even the animals knew better than us. They disappeared quietly, long before the panic, long before the riots. Occasionally you'll see a bird, thin, feral, almost skeletal, flying low, searching endlessly for something that isn't here anymore. It's hard not to feel like we're the same. And people? People adapted in the worst way. Survivors split into factions. Some formed small communities, barricaded in old factories, malls, or underground bunkers. Others became scavengers, roaming like nomads with carts of scrap metal and empty canisters. The most dangerous group, though, are the Purge walkers, those who embraced the chaos. They think the world is cleansing itself and that humans are the infection. They hunt at night, under the burnt sky, believing they're part of some divine correction. Tonight is one of the nights they celebrate, the Purge Night, a tradition built on broken laws, cracked morality, and the belief that survival must be earned with blood. Most people hide on nights like this. Me? I broadcast, because someone has to. Landmarks that used to anchor us are unrecognizable. Highways are split down the middle, buckled upward by heat. Bridges collapsed years ago, dropping into dry riverbeds like fallen giants. The stadium in my old hometown, once filled with cheering crowds, is now a hollowed-out husk where raiders gather to trade fuel or trap the desperate. Even the mountains look wrong, stripped of trees and covered in layers of smoke dust that make them appear older than time itself. There's no stable weather pattern. A single day can swing from blistering heat to windstorms that scrape skin like sandpaper. Lightning storms strike dry land, igniting fires that burn themselves out on empty soil. Sometimes, at the far edges of the horizon, you see strange green glows, auroras not of nature, but of atmospheric chemicals reacting to the sun. Every moment carries a tremor of dread, a quiet that feels too quiet, a distant sound that could mean safety or danger. I've learned to breathe shallow, listen deep, and keep my tone steady behind the microphone. Because if there's one thing we all fear more than the storms, the heat, or the purge walkers, it's the silence that comes when you realize no one is left to hear you. And still, I speak. Because if even one person is listening, the world hasn't ended. Not yet. They used to call me a host. On the good days, before the sky turned to rust, that meant I sat behind a desk under neon lights, read scripts, and smiled at a camera for an audience that had more options than trouble. Now, host means I keep a microphone warm and a coil of copper humming on nights when everything else is dead. I am the voice that scratches through the static, the one who strings together call signs, coordinates, and bad jokes so the lonely don't think they're the last. My name is Jonah Hale. Once, that name opened doors. Once, Jonah Hale paid taxes, mowed a lawn, and missed birthdays because work ran late. I had a wife who laughed too loud for the living room and a kid who thought every problem could be solved with a cardboard sword. That world folded up and burned. I buried what I could, and the rest I turn into ballast. Things to keep me from drifting into the kind of silence that learns your name and never calls it. Surviving is less a set of heroic acts and more a ledger you update every morning. The entries are small: water collected, food traded, batteries charged, antenna adjusted. Everything else is negotiation. I run a broadcast out of what used to be a community college radio tower. The rooms below stripped clean except for the generator, the transmitter, and my chair. The tower still stands by the grace of welded braces and stubborn engineering. I climb it at dawn to check the lines, to listen for new voices, to tune the beam when the ionized air eats the signal. People hear me best on nights like this, when the purge walkers roam and everyone else huddles in silence. They tune to me for a heartbeat of human sound, a cough, a laugh, a name. How do I keep going? Habit, mostly. Habit is a resilient thing, but beneath it is a duty I can't quite shake. Connection. Humans are social animals that have been denied their species' typical diet. If I can spool a ribbon of voices across miles, if I can point a lost father to a water cache 2 towns over, or tell a scared woman to wait 3 days for a traitor with clean bandages, I am coupling that loneliness back into life. That matters. It's the only coin that still buys me mornings. Practical survival takes up a measured portion of my waking brain. Water is priority 1. I run a system built from scavenged parts, a series of tarps and gutters that feed into barrels, a charcoal sand filter made from an old kettle and layered fabric, and a small kettle that sits on a wood gas stove I learned to build after watching too many videos and failing spectacularly at first. Sedimentation comes first. Let it sit, let the gunk settle to the bottom. Then I filter through cloth, then sand and charcoal, then boil until the steam writes its own truth on the inside of the pot. If the weather allows, I rig a solar still out of a glazed tarp and a shallow pan. It's slow, but on clear days it gives you what you need without burning wood. Food is patchwork. I trade voice recordings and radio repairs for canned goods and preserved meats. I garden in pots. rooftop pockets where hardy greens take root in compost made from paper, ash, and the last of the store-bought soil. I protect those pots with shade cloth because the sun has teeth now. Foraged roots and the occasional rabbit keep the protein line intact. I dry when I can. I salt and smoke scraps. I learn to preserve like a mad scientist, and every jar on my shelf is a victory against the kind of hunger that steals your kindness first. Power is the daily crisis. The pedal generator is my cathedral, an old exercise bike welded to a series of belts and coils. 2 hours of pedaling give me a night's worth of low-power broadcast and charge a bank of batteries for the small heater and the dim light over the console. My knees protest, my hands callous. Sometimes a neighbor will trade a day of pedaling for a can of coffee and a seat by the radio. Those are the mornings I feel most human, trading sweat for warmth and listening to someone else tell a story for the simple pleasure of it. I am not a saint. Guilt is a companion with no small voice. I think of my wife, her hands wrapped in flour, teaching our boy to fold paper planes, and I replay the last day we had together until I bruise the edges of it. We left too slow for the evacuation route, thinking the storm would pass. The water didn't stop. It rose with the kind of hungry speed books don't prepare you for. I can still picture the way the street looked as we ran, a moving plate glass mirror of sky. I lost them in the crowd, and then I lost the crowd. I have replayed it 1,000 ways, each a smaller kindness to myself. None of them bring them back. Loss teaches you thrift with emotion. You save pieces of people like seeds. I keep a sweater in a box that still carries her scent on good days. I keep a dented tin soldier our son refused to throw away. Those relics are anchors. They balance me against the push of despair. Trust is hard to give. There are people who will tell you the apocalypse revealed the true nature of humanity, that we are predators with a new terrain. It's true sometimes. People do bad things when survival tightens its fist. Raids happen. Scavenger bands with more firepower than sense will take what they want and leave the rest in ash. I have been robbed. I have been followed. I learned to calibrate generosity carefully. How many seeds can you spare before tomorrow becomes a burial you can't afford? But there are also small mercies. Neighbors who will trade a bandage for a broadcast. A doctor who will come out of hiding to stitch a wound in exchange for a night on the air. Those transactions form a brittle social contract that's kept pockets of humanity from dissolving entirely. The radio helps write that contract across miles. My work has a dark humor built into it. I keep a log of names and coordinates, people who called, places that hosted once, points of interest like water tank with half roof. I have a slow, private list of the dead and the living I've met. Sometimes I read from the ledger during a long night. Names matter. They remind me we were more than survival curves. The fear isn't always external. The worst dangers are internal. The slow erosion of empathy, the way you learn to walk past someone with a fever because you can't risk your scarce water for a stranger. I hate the way that feels. Every time I choose self-preservation over a life, I carve a little groove in my soul. But I also know that self-preservation keeps the radio warm. It keeps me able to help more people tomorrow than I could today. There are rules I try to live by, tiny and stubborn as the seeds I plant. 1. Always leave a message if you take from someone's place. Simple. Honest. 2. Trade fair. We are fragile economies. 3. Never broadcast coordinates unless you know who's listening. The Purge walkers like to ride the airwaves. They listen for weakness. Pragmatism is survival. Charity is a luxury shredded by gunfire. What keeps me awake at night are not the storms, but the possibility that one day my microphone will stay silent because my hands fail, or the tower collapses, or the batteries die. I think of the people who have nowhere else to turn. Will my silence be the final punctuation in some small human story? The idea of that is a weight I carry like a second backpack. So I show up. I keep the pedals turning, or I trade work for charge. I climb the tower when my knees let me, And when they don't, I patch the antenna from below with trembling hands. I tell jokes into the mic to make the static blush. I read the weather report like a prayer, even if it's a false one. I leave spaces in my voice for callers who may never come because hope makes room for itself if you let it. I am a survivor, yes, but I prefer the word transmitter. Survivors save themselves. Transmitters save each other in increments. A tip, a shared ration, a radio frequency that becomes a lifeline. If you ask me why I persist, I'll answer with a practical list. Duty, habit, barter. But beneath those is the softer truth. The human voice is stubbornly contagious. Once it finds an ear, it breeds other voices. Tonight, as the purge night breathes cold and sharp around the edges of the city, I will keep speaking. Not because I am brave, but because I am afraid of what silence does to a soul. And because somewhere beyond the red sky, a child might be listening, waiting for someone to tell them that they are not alone. They say the world narrowed first, then it hardened. You notice it in small things. A well that used to sing in the street now coughing up mud. The way the horizon looks like it was painted by someone with one color left. That narrowing is the crisis I live inside. It's not a single event you can point at and blame. It's a knot of failures that tied the sky to the ground and left us all on the wrong side. For us, the main wound is water. The rain stopped behaving. It began to come in fits. One year, a frenzy of storms that toppled whole neighborhoods. The next, nothing. The pattern unspooled until dry seasons stretched like muscle and never relaxed. Rivers that cut through the country like silver threads thinned to trickles, and then the trickles turned to cracked beds where children used to cast stones and dare each other to swim. Wells went sterile. Reservoirs, once full enough to float a dozen ships, shriveled to rings of algae and bone-white liner. The underground aquifers we'd pumped for a century started to fall. Groundwater tables dropped faster than any of the old maps predicted. When you sink a hand into the earth now, it comes back dry and dusty. The immediate cause is obvious enough if you listen to the right people. Heat. The air holds more of it, and heat is greedy. It steals moisture from soil and plants, drives evaporation, and when combined with shifting wind patterns, it rewrites where storms decide to fall. We learned the phrase jet stream in school, but no lesson prepared us for what happens when that jet stream wrinkles and stalls, when storms spin in place for a week and drown a valley, while somewhere else not a drop falls for months. When the planet traps heat, the weather doesn't forget. It repays us with extremes. Wildfires used to be seasonal. Now they are continual. Dry forests ignite from lightning strikes, and the embers jump like men with intent. Smoke became a permanent weather layer for a while, an ashy ceiling that made the sun a memory. Where trees die en masse, the land albedo shifts. Darker soil and charred trunks absorb more heat, accelerating drying. Once the trees are gone, erosion follows. Gullies carve themselves into the hills. That's how we lose soil, slowly, then in great boiling gulps. Without soil, nothing grows. I pick up the scientific scraps I can, old textbooks, a battered copy of a climatology manual salvaged from an abandoned university, conversations with a man who used to work for a utilities company and now runs a dug well with a hand pump. The mechanics boiled down to how a person might explain it over a cracked microphone. Higher atmospheric temperatures increase the air's capacity to hold moisture, which sounds like it would mean more rain overall, but the distribution changes. Some latitudes get wetter, some drier. Heat waves become longer, droughts deepen. The sea, warmed and swollen, pushes salt wedges into coastal aquifers, ruining freshwater wells. Permafrost that once locked methane becomes a leaky chest. Each of these things nudges the system a little further from what we relied on. The human effect is worse than the weather. Food chains collapsed. Crops failed in seasons that were once reliable. Livestock died in heat waves or starved when pasture turned to dust. Whole supply chains that depended on cheap energy and predictable weather splintered. Grocery stores are skeletons now, glass mouths of empty shelves, and the trucks that used to move goods became tombstones along highways, rusted hulks that tell you without words where the contracts failed. Medicines, especially antibiotics and essential chronic meds, became rarities. You trade for them like you might trade for gold or a gun. Everyone adapted in their own ugly way. Small towns formed around whatever water source they could defend. A cistern, a spring, a deep well. Those places built walls. Some became trading hubs where fuel and seeds change. Hands. Others turned cannibalistic, hemorrhaging people until nothing but a hard core remained. There are communities that try to govern by whatever laws they can remember, councils voted in, barter rules hammered out at a table. Then there are the raiders, the purge walkers, who move like a weather front, violent, chaotic, and indiscriminate. In the afternoons, when light thins, they come out to test a settlement's resolve. They aren't organized like armies, they're more like storms of men with no sense of tomorrow. My tower sits on the edge of one of those patched-together communities. We call it Harbor. Irony wasn't dead when they named it. Harbor is 10 houses, a reinforced feed store, and a school gym we shut and repurposed as a locker for food and tools. We have 3 hand pumps and 2 tankers that get refilled by a caravan from the north every fortnight, if the northern springs cooperate and if the caravan isn't raided. The caravan is our lifeline. Without it, we fall into the same cruel arithmetic the rest of the world plays. Who gets water and who doesn't? The caravan's schedule used to be predictable. Now it's a rumor. What makes survival harder is the compounding. Fuel becomes scarce. Forges, vehicles, generators. Without fuel, pumps stop. Without pumps, cisterns go empty. Without water, crops fail, animals die, people become desperate. Desperation tears trust. Trust is the lubricant of any society. When it's gone, friction creates heat, and heat creates more desperation. It's self-feeding and exponential. On the air, I tell people practical things. I tell them to conserve. I say the words into my mic, and sometimes I can hear the sound of someone else breathing in the dark. I tell them how to find groundwater. Look for the green fingers, strange bands of vegetation that don't belong, where roots reach deeper to a seam. I tell them how to make a solar still. Dig a shallow bowl, place a small container at the center, cover it with a tarp sealed to the edges, weight the center with a pebble so condensation runs toward the cup. I tell them to boil, filter, and be suspicious of sweet-smelling water. Sweet can be chemical. You do not drink standing, milky water unless you can purify it. Use cloth, then charcoal, then boiling. Boil for at least a minute at sea level. Higher elevations demand longer. Those are the basics, saved from 1,000 nights of trial and error, and from the man with the well who taught me about slowly recharging a tired aquifer by creating small infiltration pits where runoff can sink instead of racing away. Food tips are gritty. Preserve when you can. Salt, smoke, and dry. Old ways that clicked back into place when refrigeration became an industry of memory. Learn to ferment. It's forgiving and gives calories where there are few. Plant native, resilient varieties. Stuff hardy to heat and low water. Push for mulching. Shade what you have left. Protect seeds like you protect a child. Seeds are futures. Do not eat them unless you've exhausted every other option. We hoard seeds in sealed jars, buried under floorboards or in tins sunk in cool, shaded places. Fuel economy is an art now. We craft wood gas stoves to run on dried brush, an hour of burn making a surprise amount of heat without sending a column of light and smoke that can be seen for miles. Solar panels, those painted miracles, are currency. If you have a working one, you have bargaining power. Batteries, however, are perishable. Keep them at 50% charge when not in use, keep them cool, and rotate them out. That's what the techs used to say. Now we say it to each other in hushed tones. Encounters with other survivors flare the narrative. Not long ago, a woman named Mara showed up at harbor with a child and a propane tank the size of a fist. She was quiet, a professional liar with a smile that kept layerings beneath. She traded a week's water for a radio repair. She said there was a group 2 days east with a real doctor, a place where they were trying to desalinate brackish groundwater. We debated sending men. Sending people is always a math of risk versus gain. We sent Tom and 2 others. The caravan never returned. Weeks later, a band of men claimed they'd met Tom's group and left them with empty packs at a dried riverbed. We found a scarf in the dust and a boot sole with Tom's tread. Mara left 3 nights after that, under the cover of one of those red skies, and we never saw her again. Trust is a brittle thing here. Then there are the miracles. The traders who run routes with ice chests and medicine. The doctor who answers a call and stitches a wound in exchange for airtime. The quiet engineer who taught me how to strip an old solar array and rebuild the inverter so the tower could sing again. There are moments when people come together like ducks in a sudden rain, trading knowledge and work and listening to each other with a hunger that goes beyond food. Those moments save us more surely than any caravan. Limitations pile up like stacked plates. Water, always water. Fuel, medicine, clean bandages and antibiotics. Batteries for radios and prosthetics. Seed stock, tools, and parts. We ration everything like a miser guarding the last ember. Every ration decision is a moral exam with no answers. Give water to a sick man, and you may lose a seed that could have fed a child next season. Those decisions weigh on the council, on me when I tell callers where to find resources and when to run, on every human who has to choose. The weather is no longer predictable, and that unpredictability is a predator. One moment the day is hot and brittle. The next, the horizon thickens, and you can see the dust advance. A low, obscene wall, carrying fine grit, chemical ash from burned fields, and sometimes things that make your eyes burn. We learned to shutter the ventilation holes with soaked fabric and to create sealed sleeping spaces with tarps and activated, charcoal-lined pockets to filter the air a little. It's hardly protection, but it is work against the storm. There are nights I broadcast through coughs because the air is that thick, and on those nights, fewer people call. Scientifically, the solutions long-term are outside our reach. They require policy, money, and international coordination, the language of the old world. For us, the tactical answers are local and brutal. Create micro-catchments to harvest every drop of runoff. Build greywater systems to reuse water for irrigation. Teach everyone to replant drought-tolerant hedgerows to reduce erosion. Bury water tanks underground to reduce evaporation. Invest in low-tech desalination for coastal communities using solar still arrays. Protect seed banks in cool, dark places. Share knowledge of foraging, seasonal cycles, and safe preservation. These measures buy time. That's all they do, buy time. Tonight, the crisis settles like a low-pressure system over us. The forecast, what little we can trust, predicts a heat burst that will sap our remaining surface water and a dust front from the west that may deliver chemical ash. The caravan is late. Raider activity has increased. The tankers that supply the neighboring towns reported an ambush 3 days ago. I read the names on my ledger and find myself adding contingency plans. Who gets the generator if the gym's batteries fail? Alternate wells within an hour's walk, and the list of people we would send with the caravan as escorts. Planning is improvisation dressed up as certainty. We are not merely battling nature. We are fighting the social disease that follows scarcity, mistrust, theft, desperation. That is the cruelest part. The crisis magnifies what we are. Some of us melt into kindness. Some harden into predators. The line between is thin and always shifting. I speak into the microphone and try to thread the needle. Enough truth to keep people prepared. Enough hope to stop them from giving up. It is a dangerous balance, but balance is the only weapon we have left that is not made of gunmetal. On the air tonight, I will tell them to seal their containers, to check their buckets for contamination, to patrol the perimeter at dusk, to move the batteries into cool storage. I will tell them how to make a solar still from a window pane and an old pot. I will read a weather check, and in between, I will play a scratchy song someone sent from a town 3 days away, the kind of music that used to seem trivial but now tastes like memory. Because in crisis, information is as valuable as water. A warning can save a life. A map of a hidden spring can save a village. A well-timed joke can keep someone from reaching for a bottle they shouldn't touch. My voice is small and frayed, but it travels. If the storm breaks our line tonight, then all we had was a whisper against the wind. If it holds, then perhaps we buy another day. We're bargaining with weather and with human cowardice and with a ledger that never balances. That's the crisis. That's the math. And tomorrow, the numbers will be worse unless we stitch ourselves together, small stitch by small stitch. They tell stories of slow endings like they happen on a single day. One sky, one storm, one reckoning. But the truth is uglier. The world eats itself in small bites, day by day, until the tablecloth is gone and you're left with a paper plate and a memory of silver. The last month has been one of those small bites. Each morning brings a new accounting of what we've lost, and each night I try to make the ledger look honest on the air. Water slipped another notch this week. The northern caravan that usually brings our tanker rolled in late, 3 days late, and when it finally limped into harbor, it brought fear more than relief. 2 trucks had been burned out along the interstate. The drivers came in hollow, their faces taut with the kind of fear that doesn't go away with sleep. They spoke of an ambush at a bridge, of shadows moving in the dust, and of a string of bodies left in the roadside ditch as a message. They left us less than half a load this round, and the tanker's valve leaked through a cracked fitting. We repaired it with baling wire and a prayer. We stretched the water and took shorter rations. We argued about who should get the extra gallon. Old Mr. Kessler, whose kidney is thin and who has a cough that never stops, or the school's compost bins, which will die if they don't get a little more water this week. But the caravan story had another layer. Whispers about a route that bypassed the burned bridge, a path through a shuttered industrial park 2 towns over. A man in the caravan swore that one of the raider bands, one called the Black Tines, had been using that industrial maze as a base. He also said, with a kind of half-laughter that tasted like late regret, that he'd heard of a scent of water past the ruins, a shower of springs they called Glasswell. Names like that are dangerous in a dying world. They are a kind of currency. People hear Glasswell, and they stop mourning long enough to dream. Dreams are contagious. They make you forget you have to ration. They make you vote to send scouts. We had debates in harbor that spiraled into old arguments. Send men and risk the caravan's remaining drivers, or keep our hands on what we have and wait for luck. I argued for prudence. Tom, who used to be a city cop before he decided to grow a beard and forget his badge, argued for action. He called me sentimental, which hit a place I keep bandaged. Sentimentality keeps people alive sometimes. It keeps us humane. But it also gets caravans shot. A younger woman, Nima, who runs the feed store's barter ledger with a pencil sharpened down to the last soft wood, brought a thin piece of paper to the meeting. On it was a hand-drawn route and a note. Glasswell, 3 days east, spring under the old glassworks. The paper smelled faintly of engine oil and someone else's fear. Nima had gotten it the way half of our rumors arrive here, folded in a package from a visiting trader. Traders traffic in rumor as much as they do in fuel. They know which stories fetch a higher price. I wanted to believe it. Hope is a lever we can use to move ourselves out of pits. But I have listened to too many tales in the static. I have watched caravans set out with bright eyes and return like bent toys. I know what desire does to men with guns. Still, when she pushed the paper across the table, I felt the old tug in my chest, a muscle that remembers the sound of running water like a lullaby. We decided to send a scouting party. Tom, two others, Miguel and Len, and a woman named Mara. Mara arrived a week before, timing herself like someone who had practiced the art of appearing at the right time. She had traded a sealed roll of antiseptic gauze for a radio repair and had a way of smirking at the world that made it hard to know if you were being looked at or measured. She said she had information from a friend who'd camped near the glassworks last month and returned alive. That is the sort of thing people cling to. We gave them 3 days' water and a small solar panel to run a pump in case they found anything of use. We gave them a sketch map and a two-way set tuned to my frequency. I watched them leave at dusk. The sky that night was a thin bruise. They walked toward a horizon the color of old pennies, shadows lengthening. I ran the antenna for signal checks until my hands cramped, then I sat in the chair and listened to the room breathe. They did not call back on the second night. On the third day, we waited until dusk and then stayed up until dawn. On the fourth morning, someone found a boot, half buried in a dust bluff 2 miles south of the old interstate. The sole had Tom's tread. We sent scouts. They found more: discarded cups, a length of rope cut cleanly, tire tracks that did not belong to our people. In a shallow ditch, they found an empty water bladder, one that should have been full. Someone had scoured it with sand until it was clean and useless. The leftover trail threaded west into the industrial park. A week later, a boy came into harbor. He stumbled in the heat, his lips cracked and rimed with salt from dried sweat. He had Tom's bandana tied around his arm. He said he'd seen them, Tom and his group, taken by men in masks who moved like a cloud and disappeared into the glassworks. He said he'd crawled through a line of rusted shipping containers and seen a courtyard with a pipe that still dripped a fruitless trickle. He said there were chains and people sleeping under tarps and a watchtower made from scaffold. His voice was small and scared and very human. Stories do not always line themselves neatly into truth. We sent a rescue at once, because rescue is sometimes the only honest answer a community can give to grief. We couldn't leave Tom to the dust. Ledger I keep had his name, and it would not reconcile with silence. We took with us Mara because she insisted, and because her hands are steady, and because when people are stubborn, sometimes they break the world into pieces that can be carried. The glassworks smelled like metal and old forge smoke. The place was a maze of broken skylights and furnaces that had turned into nests of scavengers. The ground glittered with shards. It sounded like walking through a graveyard of teeth. We found signs of occupation, makeshift kitchens, a rope ladder, a burned mattress. We also found tracks, many kinds, layered like a bad history lesson. We did not find Tom. We found, instead, a message hammered into the entrance of an old office with lipstick or grease. There is no sanctity left for ink, that read, "Glasswell is real. Trust no map." The letters bled into the cement and into my mind like something that could not be removed. That was the point when harbor felt suspended between two disasters: the physical, dwindling water, diminishing fuel, and the human, mistrust, rumors, and the predators who pushed the knife edge between survival and slaughter. Rumors like Glasswell have teeth. They bring out the hopeful and the hungry, and sometimes the cruel, drooling for the chance to claim what others clutch. Meanwhile, the Purge walkers ramped up their patrols. They roamed like a plague that had found purpose. They came in small convoys of patched-up trucks with metal teeth welded to the bumpers. On one night, they rolled through the outer perimeter at dawn, herding our goats into the open like they were testing how far they could push us. We responded with a barrage of noise, pots and pans, and the radios turned up to uncomfortably loud static. It worked for an hour. The walkers moved on. That night, an old woman in Harbor's corner garden, who keeps tomatoes in a way that feels like prayer, was taken in the confusion. We found only her walking stick and the smell of tomatoes in the path. The moral calculus kept getting harder. Do you post guards at every gate and risk someone stepping on a landmine you cannot afford? Do you devote a man to the patrols who could instead maintain the solar array that keeps the water pump humming? The answers are never clean. We sleep like people who have been wrung out and laid on the line to dry. The radio helps, but it also exposes us. Frequencies carry. In a luxury of old days, you might share coordinates with strangers because someone higher up could be trusted. Now, the airwaves are a thoroughfare for predators. The Purge walkers scan the bands between their raids looking for lax security. I learned to use code. Times that mean nothing to the uninitiated. Phrases that double as warnings. It's a tiny language, and it keeps us living a little longer. But code only slows the inevitable cleverness of those who would hunt us. Amidst this escalating threat came an odd novelty, an actual broadcast unlike our own. 1. Night, a faint signal flared on a frequency I don't usually use, carrying a woman's voice pitched with a kind of careful science. She spoke of a salt-slow distillery, and a small desal unit cobbled from copper coils and a condenser salvaged from a refrigerated transport. She described a method to draw brackish water and separate the salt with low-energy input. It sounded too technical to be a mere rumor. It sounded like the whisper of someone who'd read too many manuals and not enough lies. The message repeated 3 times before fading. Then, it was gone. We chased that signal like it was an animal, listening and burning batteries to triangulate. For 2 nights, we got static. On the 3rd night, a lone caller came through. An old radio technician from a coastal town 200 miles away said they'd gotten the same broadcast, and that a woman named Dr. Amara had been working on low-tech desalination for months. He said she'd been trying to form a consortium of coastal towns to rebuild a pipeline of potable water, and that the broadcast was a repeating beacon carrying her procedural notes, recipes in a way, for communities that lacked fancy parts. If true, that was a way out. Desalination at scale is energy expensive, but a solar-driven copper boiler setup could pull a trickle of fresh water from brackish sources, enough to support a small settlement if coupled with rationing and storage. It wouldn't end the drought, but it would buy breathing room. So now we had 2 myths on the map. Glasswell, a possible natural artesian spring, and Dr. Amara's desal recipe, a technological myth. Both promised water. Both promised risk. Both promised the attention of men who do not think in human terms. That's when trust becomes more than a sentimental notion. It becomes strategy. Do you pool your remaining solar panels to build a desal pilot and hope the panels aren't taken mid-construction? Do you keep them and defend them like an armory, hoarding energy as if it were a bullet? If the glasswell is real, do you march en masse to claim it and expose harbor to the kind of attention that brings the walkers? Or do you wait and wither? I broadcast all of this in fragments on a lonely night when the wind had settled, and the static on the tower sounded like ocean surf. I spoke carefully about the signal, about the empty tanker, and about the boot we found. I read a recipe for a solar still, basic enough to be useful, and then I let a caller fill the air with a song about rain. Sometimes music does more than maps. Inside, I was a ledger of contradiction. I wanted to mount a rescue for Tom and the lost. I wanted to believe Glasswell and to courier sailors to Dr. Amara. I wanted to hoard panels and seeds and bandages. I wanted to be heroic and prudent and generous in equal measure, and the tug left me a little raw. Then there was the personal calculus. What is my duty as a transmitter? My step is to give out knowledge and to point toward actions people can take. But knowledge leads people. Knowledge can be a leash. It is a dangerous responsibility. If I point too directly, Glasswell is here, go now. I could send 6 desperate hands stumbling into the teeth of the walkers. If I remain quiet, I betray the truth or the rumor and the people who trusted me. Trust keeps tightening like a noose. I find myself lying to protect people I care about, bending the truth until it fits into the shape of safety. I hate that I do it. Yet sometimes deceit saves. The boy who came with Tom's bandana? I told him there were 2 cars coming in for him and gave him water. Whether that was true or not, at least he drank. Tension is no longer an abstract word in harbor. It is the sound of boots on planks. It is the metallic creak of the water tank when the wind presses on it. It is the slow calculus of ration sheets and children's faces. The world pushes at the seams, and every choice we make stretches the fabric more. Tonight, the radio crackles with more than static. Someone calling themselves Miner reports seeing a column of smoke to the west where the industrial park sits. There is a convoy of 3 unknown vehicles moving north at dawn. Mara sharpens a blade and stares into the dark. Tom's name sits in my log like a prayer. I will sleep badly, if at all. I will edit the playlist, tune the transmitter, and write down contingency plans. I will wait for the dawn to tell me which rumor was true and which one broke us. The rising action of this long catastrophe is not a single drumbeat. It's a gathering storm of small violences and bright, dangerous hope. We are hemmed in by both, by the heat and dust we cannot control, and by the hunger and cunning of the men who move in its wake. The world is tightening, and Harbor is one of the few places that still breathes in a measured way. Tonight, we hold our breaths and listen for the sound of someone calling on the air. If it is Tom, if it is Rescue, if it is Glasswell or Dr. Amara, or the caravan with enough diesel to keep the pumps running another month, then maybe tomorrow can be bought. If it is the walkers, then tomorrow will be the day we learn what sacrifice looks like. And if it is nothing at all, if the air stays empty and the sky does not answer, then tonight will have been another night when we chose to keep talking into an indifferent wind. That choice matters. It is both a small defiance and a fragile tether. I keep broadcasting because even when the world tightens its fist, a voice can still reach an ear. And an ear can start a fire where the world tried to snuff one out. They came in all at once, the dust, the walkers, the phone call that never came. For a long minute, the world narrowed into a single set of sounds. The generator's complaining breath, the soft clack of a relay under too much load, and the far-off bump of tires like distant thunder. Then the comms lit up with frantic voices, Scout, Harbor Gate, Movement West, and everything rushed into a kind of violent clarity. We'd had 2 solid leads, Glasswell and the desal beacon. We'd split our thin hope between the two like you split a single crust of bread with a child. Tom's rescue had been the excuse to move, the reason a handful of us went west. Mara, stubborn and sure, had led with a rope and a blade and a mouth that could talk a wary dog into sitting. They found a courtyard with a pipe that still wept, just enough to make you dizzy with longing, but they also found a watchtower and men with masks who liked the way fear smelled. We were too late to bring all of them home clean. When the boy limped in with Tom's bandana, I felt the bone-cold spike in my ribs, sadness shaped like a hook. We went anyway. People don't leave one of their own to the dust if they can help it. Even now, that stubbornness keeps communities from dying quietly. But rescue didn't go by plans. It went by improvisation and courage and the stupid hope that maybe the world still obeyed a rule or two. We mounted a night move to the glassworks, slipped through the fractures of rust and broken skylight, and found a pocket where men slept under tarps, some tied, some dozing with weapons within reach, some chained. We moved in like ghosts with purpose. We cut, we pushed, we whispered. We found Tom near a furnace, gaunt, furious, alive. That felt like a miracle in a place that specialized in the opposite. The jubilation was short, because light on the horizon told an ancient story. Storms come on borrowed time. The scanner we cobbled from an old weather radio threw up a warning, westbound dust front, velocity high, particles so fine they chew your lungs. More worrying was the rumble on the road. The walkers were converging. Someone had scouted a convoy moving north toward the glassworks. That's when the math got brutal. Back at Harbor, they counted our losses and our gains. We had Tom, bandaged and breathing, but we had used fuel and time to get him back. The caravan was still late. The walkers liked to pick off the wounded and the slow. If they hit us while we were repairing the tanker or while folks were out scrounging for parts, it would be carnage. I remember something my wife said once. her voice like the bright end of a match, about choosing the small kindness over the grand gesture. There is grace in smallness. Tonight, though, smallness felt like chopping at a tree with a spoon. As radio man, my decisions were all in the electromagnetic territory. The transmitter on my tower was the most powerful noisemaker left for miles. With enough wattage and the right cadence, I could mask signals, create a phantom convoy, or throw out a beacon that would sound like a lone trader with a full tank. It was a trick of human behavior. Wolves listen for the sound of weak men and flock to it. You could make wolves chase wind. The desal plans Dr. Amara had broadcast, the copper coil and condenser recipe, were brilliant in their austerity. It wasn't a factory, but it was a method. Build a small condenser array, run it off steadily charging batteries and solar during the day, harvest brackish water, and you'd get a trickle of drinkable water. Enough to keep the sick alive while you negotiated for better. But the panels we had were few, and the batteries were in the gym behind lock and key because the council had decided they were Harbor's last strategic asset. Tonight, the choices stacked up like cards in a shaking hand. Keep the tower on to coordinate, to keep morale, to broadcast warnings and music and the safety that comes from knowing a voice is there. Or pull every last amp into the desal pilot and goddamn hope it yields enough water for a week. There was a third option, crueler in its cunning. Use the tower to create a lure, a high-powered phantom convoy signal to draw the walkers away from the glassworks while the rest of us ferried people and the small desal unit into place. The lure would require me to crank the generator beyond recommended hours, to siphon batteries, and to sit on the roof like a light on a cliff. If the walkers decided to look for me instead of the convoy, I would be right where they could find me. You learn, in the end, what kind of person you are by the decisions you make when the sky is red and the stakes are meat-sized. I thought of my boy folding cardboard swords in our living room. I thought of the sweater I kept in the box and how its sleeve still smelled like a laugh. Duty is a thing shaped out of grief more than heroism. It's what you do because no one else will. I chose the lure. We had hours. Not enough to build a full desal array and not enough to hold the walkers off if they hit the perimeter. Still, movement beats stillness. I fed the tower with every battery we had, rewiring the console until the heat seeped into my palms. I put a looped recording on a frequency we knew the walkers monitored, a gravelly voice simulating a trader complaining about a broken axle and abundant fuel 3 miles south. I crafted the cadence to sound like a vulnerable, well-stocked target. Bait, basically. Mara helped splice in the static and the tape hiss. Tom, still weak, sat by with a bandage around his temple, eyes like a man who'd been given a second chance and didn't know how to spend it. The generator screamed more than it should have, a stressed animal. The wires tasted like too much amp. Every minute I cranked out the lure, I felt like I was siphoning life from the tower. The trade-off was clean. Buy the convoy's attention and buy us the window to move people and parts to the desal pilot. Or keep broadcasting honest and risk the walkers stumbling into the glassworks and finding easy targets. I went to the mic. My voice sounded small and flat to me, but from the console it came out vast, amplified, a thing that pushed through static and made the night listen. Trader on Route 7, this is Romo's rig, requesting help for a broken axle. Full tanks, medical kit, 2 children. Please, any out there help? I layered it with the looped sounds, struggling engine, the nervous laugh, and then I cut to music, a cheap tune that would sound real. The walkers could not resist real human weakness. From the glassworks we heard, through patched radios and the channel I'd set for the operation, the sound of boots far off, and then the altercation of metal. I felt a small, almost obscene relief when the walkers answered the bait. They sent a scout. Then they shifted. Fuel trucks turned toward my frequency like metal tide. It was working. We moved fast. Pallets of canned food, the small copper coil sealed in an oilcloth, the precious solar panel load. People ferried the desal parts by hand. Everybody who could carry did. The aerial dust rolled in as if summoned. A low wall on the horizon, a living thing that ate color. The wind hit, and the sky turned ash. It was beautiful in the way disasters are, a terrible grace. I stayed at the tower because the lure needed hands. I stayed not because I wanted glory, but because someone had to be the noise, the false promise the walkers chased. I watched the generator's needle climb into the red. The motor began to howl with a keening that felt personal. I could smell burning, insulation, lacquer, old mistakes. I thought for a sliver of a second about shutting it down, and then I thought about Tom's boy, and the old woman with the tomatoes, and the whole ledger of names that keeps me alive. I twisted the throttle more. The walkers rolled in like storm shadows, trucks with teeth welded to their frames, men with masks that made them less human and therefore easier to hate. Their lead truck turned toward the radio flare, lights cutting through the dust. For a pulse, I imagined them going the other way, empty-handed. For a pulse, the plan worked, and then the world narrowed again. One of their trucks broke down less than a mile from the tower. A mechanic that probably didn't exist for them tugged at a belt and cursed. Others dismounted and walked to the sound. I could hear them through the static, voices, laughter, the high, cruel humor of men who find sport in hunting. They came up the ridge toward the tower like a pack on the approach. You don't get used to your palms shaking. They are faithful betrayers. I thought about the sweater in the box, and about the stories I tell on air to keep people from thinking of those sweaters. I thought about what my voice had become, a lure, a comfort, a tool. All our tools have edges. When they reached the base of my tower, it sounded like a chorus of hands beating on old tin. I had rigged a simple low-frequency pulse, an acoustic false heartbeat, designed to sound like an engine starting and then failing. It was supposed to buy us time, to make them pause and listen for a vulnerability. Instead, it was the signal that drew the walkers up the ladder. I could have run. There was always a path off the tower. The hill behind it was steep but passable. But running would have sent a signal all its own, desertion. It would have told them the noise was bait. I thought of Tom's face when we cut him loose. I thought of the ledger. I sat down on the top rung and kept my hand on the microphone, the other clutching the rail. The wind tried to pry me loose. They called up to me, a shout, then the single word that means everything in this world. Surrender! If you had asked me then whether I believed in gods or fate or luck, I would have given you a half answer. There wasn't time for theological debates. There was only the choice. Make them come up and risk the fall of harbor, or let them tear through the outskirts and claim our water and our people. I chose the former. The first man climbed the ladder with the confidence of someone who'd never lost anything that mattered. He reached the platform and looked at me with a mask that made his voice a muffled thing. He had a gun. He had friends. He had no idea how much I loved a sweater in a box. I spoke into the mic in the clear, steady voice I used for weather reports and story breaks. This is Jonah Hale, Harbor Broadcast. You listen to static and you call it truth. I have nothing but the weather and 2 songs and a name list. Take the noise. But know that the names I read into the dark mean something. You take them and you step into a world where people remember faces. It was bluff and poetry and a prayer. I made no move to raise my hands. The man, maybe 28, maybe 25, stared at me like someone surprised by mercy. For a beat, he lowered his weapon. But mercy is fragile when someone else is hungry. The second man pushed forward. They wanted the tower because it drew more than human prey. It drew information. And because in their mind, silence equaled power. The fight, if it can be called that, lasted seconds. I was not a fighter in the way they were. I had radio skills and stubborn lungs. I cursed and I threw my shoulder, and the tower rang with the sound of a body hitting metal. A bullet grazed past, hot and meaningless for me. It tore through a wire and the relay popped. The generator choked. The mic went dead in my hand. I could feel the tower convulse as the current failed. Then, the sound that I will carry forever, 1,000 feet away, I heard a shout. Harbor's people had seen something in the dust line or had taken advantage of the walkers' distraction. They came with what they had: axes, Molotovs, a disguise of noise and fury. Mara, who had cut through a dozen tight places with a smile before, led the counter. They burst like sudden rain. In the scuffle, I had time to look at Tom, standing a little off, bandage-wrapped, eyes wide with a gratitude he had not learned how to hold. And I realized the math was odd. You could trade one man's broadcast for the lives of many, but you could never measure the weight of a saved child or an old woman's tomatoes in amps. The generator smoked, a small black chimney. The mic was dead. My hands stung like something had scolded them. When the dust settled and the walkers retreated with curses and slashed tires, Harbor came together like a living thing mending itself. People cheered in the way survivors do, quiet, incredulous. We had bought what felt like an hour, and in that hour, the desal pilot was assembled, and the first trickle of brackish made its way through copper coils and into a small, beaten pot. We had maybe a gallon of new water, and because of that gallon, we could keep a few people alive through the next hot day. I sat on the ground, the smell of burnt insulation in my hair, and thought of all the things I had kept and all the things I had let go. The tower was scarred but standing. The transmitter would take work. My hands ached. My voice was hoarse in the way voices become when they've spoken through too much. Tom came over and sat beside me. He put a hand on my shoulder, awkward, grateful. He said two things. "You saved us," and then quieter, "You kept talking." Both were true, and neither one captured the whole. I had chosen to be bait. I had chosen to be the noise that drew wolves away. I had nearly paid the ledger's last debt with my life. But looking around at the faces lit by a single oxygen-giving lantern and at the small copper coil glinting like a promise, I felt something like clarity. The duty of a transmitter is not just to inform, it is to direct, to protect, to know when your voice must become a tool instead of a comfort. That is a hard thing to accept. It is harder to practice. The dust passed. The desal trickle was slow, but it existed. We had Tom. We had a boy who might sleep tomorrow without the taste of salt in his mouth. The walkers had been chased off or merely delayed. They would be back in some shape. The caravan was still late. The sky remained its bruised, permanent color. I returned to the tower the next morning with a toolbox and a head full of static and a heart that had learned a new kind of calculation. The transmitter could be fixed. The generator would mourn its insult, but parts can be scavenged. I had no illusions. We had purchased time, not a miracle. That night I climbed the tower and opened the mic. My voice was a little steadier. I read names into the air, those who helped, those who worked, those we'd lost and those we'd not yet found. I told a small, honest story about a man who had been bait and a town that had been brave. I told them simply how to build a temporary desal condenser from scavenged copper and why to protect seeds like children. Information is ammunition in this world. We had used it, and we had been burned by it, and we had learned to respect its flame. Maybe the world will break us in ways that cannot be patched. Maybe the walkers will return with more cunning, and the next choice will be crueler. Tonight we had water. Tonight we had Tom. Tonight, a radio man who once missed birthdays for work had found a use for grief. There was no triumphant music, no glorious end. The sky stayed its bruised color. The generator needed parts. But on the air I could hear a caller, a small voice, a child perhaps, asking if anyone could teach her to fold a paper sword. I smiled into the mic. "I'll show you," I said, and I meant it. That, in the end, was the point. Not the victory, not the survival stats, but the tiny human acts we choose. The tower still hummed, damaged and raw. The world still burned. But for the first time in weeks, maybe months, Harbor slept with a lighter chest. We had bought time, and time, in this ruined calculus, is a currency worth hoarding. The dust settled like a benediction and then stayed, as if the world hadn't learned how to be gentle. For a long time after the fight at the tower, I moved like a man who had been given a second chance and suspected a catch. The generator coughed pieces for a week. Its bearings had been scored and insulation burned through. Wires hung like tired ropes. We salvaged what we could. Tom and Miguel crawled under the cowling. Len ran to the feed store for solder and a strip of copper. Mara negotiated for a replacement belt with a trader who owed Harbor a favor. It was work that looked ordinary until you remembered how rare ordinary work had become. The desal pilot kept doing the only thing it could, drip. The trickle of fresh water ran slower than my patience, but it ran. We learned how to steward every drop. 2 liters went to the clinic, antibiotics and a gauze pack that needed clean water to do any good. Half a liter went to the old man with the cough. We rationed him to ease his breathing at night. The rest went to seedlings in the gym's raised beds, because hope only grows when you give it a place to take root. It was ridiculous, a kind of arithmetic that sometimes felt silly. Divert a cup of potable water to a sprouting lettuce that might feed you in 8 weeks. But the lettuce meant something beyond calories. It meant that we could still imagine a season, even a small one. The walkers did not go gentle. They took their scorn north where they found easier prey, and then they tested the edges of Harbor like a dog on a fence. They slashed tires one night, leaving us with fewer vehicles for foraging, and once they stole a rotor blade off an old drone we'd scavenged just to spite us. Their absence after the battle was a delay, not a defeat. We all knew they would come back, and part of the aftermath was planning like engineers with too few parts. We reinforced gates with welded angles, stacked up sandbags where the outer fence had rot, and taught every able pair of hands how to set a simple noise trap, pots strung against wire, to give us early warning. None of it felt sufficient, but it bought minutes, and minutes are the currency of living. For me, the most tangible change was not in the physical repairs, but in the ledger I keep. After the battle, I added a new column. Before, my ledger listed names, coordinates, and calls. Now it had actions. Who patched the generator? Who brought the gauze? Who kept watch on the southern ridge that night? I read those names on air sometimes, not as elegy, but as credit. We were small economies of gratitude now. We traded thanks like a currency that folds. Inside myself, things shifted in ways less tidy. The choice to be bait had been a rock I polished with thought for days. I had volunteered my voice and my risk. I had sat on the tower and given the walkers a target. The aftermath of that decision was not simple heroism. It was less tidy. I found I had less patience for moralizing and more room for practical tenderness. When I used to think of duty, I imagined grand arcs, big rescues, headlines in a world that had no headlines. After that night, I learned duty in coaxing someone through a fever, in the way you scrape a burned kettle clean so it can be used again. My ethics felt less like philosophy and more like plumbing. Guilt sat on my chest some days like a small, immovable stone. There are faces that live in that guilt. The old woman with tomatoes whose walking stick we found after the walkers pushed through, the boy who brought Tom's bandana, and the trader who lost a leg somewhere between Harbor and the interstate. I could make a ledger of wrongs too, and I did. But I tried each morning to balance it with a list of small reparations. We made a shrine, an old cabinet in the gym, where we left artifacts for those we'd lost. A paper sword, a dented tin soldier, a knitted mitten with a hole. People came and touched the items, then went out to the work of living. Rituals heal in a slow, stubborn way. Nature did not heal in any meaningful sense. The sky kept its bruised color and the soil kept its memory of drought. Erosion still gnawed at the edges of our plots. Some of the seedlings died in a hot week when a dust flare turned the air into flour for a day. But there were tiny rebellions. A stubborn row of tomato shoots in Mrs. Kessler's corner garden pushed up a pale green, and the boy who had Tom's bandana learned to water with a careful hand, his fingers gentler than he had any right to be. Those small things felt enormous. Recovery here is not the return of forests, it is the holding of what little life we can keep. Trust, that fragile instrument, was harder to repair. Mara disappeared after a month. She traded for goods in a town westward and never came back. Rumor said she'd been taken as a bargaining chip and sold down a line of camps. Her absence hollowed us in a new way. We had to deal with the practicalities of betrayal and the grief of it, and it forced us to get better at being cautious without turning to paranoia. We instituted a simple rule: no one goes out alone to trade. 2 is a better number than 1 in a world that contains men who believe. Fear is delicious. My on-air persona changed. I kept the cadence and the jokes because people needed them, but I also layered in protocols. I taught call and response check-ins, an established phrase that meant safe, another that meant I'm compromised. I created a rolling list of small technical tips: how to bury a tank to reduce evaporation, how to mix a basic charcoal filter, how to arrange seed jars so they survive a heat flare. My voice became part practical manual, part storybook. People wrote me letters, scratchy notes folded into radio repair packages, and sometimes a child would call and ask how to fold a paper sword. I taught them, and every folding was an act of defiance. The desal unit became a community project. We repurposed a shipping crate as a shaded enclosure to reduce evaporation, and we mounted the remaining solar panels on a scaffold where they could be guarded easily. It produced enough water to stave off immediate collapse for a handful of people, and that was victory enough. We learned to rotate consumption schedules: morning refresh for the clinic, evening for children, midday for the labs and seeds. It's an ugly arithmetic, but effective. The pilot also taught us that simple engineering married to communal discipline can buy days and then weeks. That was not a fix for the climate, it was a way to live with it. People changed too. Faces in harbor hardened into lines that read stories. Some left, newly brave or newly foolish. Others came in seeking shelter or trade. The caravan finally limped through 3 weeks later with a single truck and a driver missing an ear. They brought diesel and a small box of antibiotics. The return of the caravan was not triumphal. It was pragmatic. We shared the goods in smaller, more guarded portions than before. We had learned how quickly generosity can be weaponized. At night, when the tower hummed enough to be gentled and the desal trickle ticked like a small clock of mercy, I held 2 images in my head: a sweater folded in a box with the faint scent of my wife, and a paper sword a child had sent me after my broadcast lesson. Both are small and fragile things. Both make the world bearable. I found myself thinking less of grand narratives and more about the ledger work of sustaining people day to day. I took to reading names on the air more often, names of the living who helped fix a promontory of hope, and names of the lost whose memory seeds the next action. Names remind us that there are networks of obligation and tenderness that survive better than any law. They are the rails we build when government rails fall away. I am still haunted by a private, practical fear that one day the tower will go quiet because I cannot keep it running. The fear keeps me precise: batteries rotated, panels shaded, pedaling shifts scheduled. It forces me to train others to be transmitters. I teach a girl named Lale how to splice coax and how to read a weather pattern on a cheap handheld. Training someone else is an act of hope because it acknowledges that my voice, however important, will not be the last. The environmental picture remains bleak. There was a brief drizzle 3 weeks after the battle, more a memory of rain than rain itself, enough to wet the dust into a darker color for a day and send a smell through the town that felt like forgiveness. People lined up with cupped hands and laughed like children. We all slept a little easier that night, but the patterns hold: heat, drought, dust. Recovery will not be quick or even consistent. The world has been shifted onto a new axis, and learning to orbit its cruelty will take generations, if it happens at all. So what has changed in me? I am smaller in my illusions and larger in my obligations. I have learned that courage is not always a shout. Sometimes it is a stubbornness to keep calling names into the dark. I have learned that leadership is often a matter of listening longer and deciding harder. I have learned the ledger is more honest than any speech. We are not saved. We are not healed. We are a community that has learned a few new trades: how to patch a generator, how to rig a low-energy condenser, how to recognize a man who will take rather than ask. We are not safe from the walkers, but we are better at watching for them. We are not beyond hunger, but we are better at stretching the bread we have. On the air that week, I read the new ledger, and then, because humans are soft with contradiction, I played a stupid old tune someone had sent and taught a child how to fold a paper sword live. A caller, soft-voiced, maybe 8, said into the static that he'd made a sword and that his mother had smiled. I cried then, quietly, and the tears tasted like something I used to call normal. The aftermath is a ledger of small repairs and slow healing. It is a map of scars and of stitches holding flesh together. It is the sound of a desal trickle and the smell of toasted coffee from a pot that took a day to coax into heat. It is the steady, stubborn act of deciding, again and again, that another day is worth the trouble. Tomorrow we will check the perimeter, rotate the batteries, and teach someone else to read the weather pattern on the cheap handheld. I will climb the tower and listen. I will speak into the mic because silence is a predator in its own right. I will read a name and fix a wire and water a lettuce with a single precious cup. That is my work. That is the aftermath. Not an ending, but the beginning of another small, sharp survival.